These two students are about to debate the topic, Resolved. Violent revolution is a just response to political oppression. On the affirmative, debater 1536. On the negative, debater 1521. Good luck. May the debate begin.
If everyone is ready, then the reading of the 6-minute first affirmative constructive will begin. I affirm the resolution resolved. Violent revolution is a just response to political oppression. Per the resolution, the value or end goal of today's debate is justice, defined by Aristotle as giving each their due. Giving each person their due requires protecting their rights. John Rawls explains that the rights secured by justice are not subject to political bargaining or the calculus of social interest. Therefore, the value criterion, or means of acting justly, is protecting rights. I have two observations for today's debates. First, the consequences of our actions matter, but so does the context in which we make decisions. It is always just to kill to save your life, but it is not just to kill if you are not being threatened. In the same way, the affirmative burden in this debate is to demonstrate that the specific context of oppression legitimizes violence. With this in mind, the resolution is talking about actual oppression, not the perception of oppression. My second observation is that terrorist groups who are not genuinely responding to political oppression are not relevant to this debate. Everyone agrees that Al-Qaeda are unjust, and there is no controversy over whether we should condemn terrorism. Contention one is that political oppression is prevalent and systematically takes away citizens' rights. The vast majority of people around the world live in regimes where their liberties are not adequately protected. Professor Eckeyard from Harvard explains that more than a third of the world lives under authoritarian rule, while just 6.4% enjoy full democracy. In these regimes, the civic spaces where citizens exercise their rights to speech, assembly, and association are fundamentally dismantled. The Civicus Monitor, which surveys every country around the world, explains that there are 27 countries with closed civic space, 50 with repressed civic space, and 40 with obstructed civic space, meaning that 117 of 197 countries are experiencing severe restrictions on fundamental freedoms. The Monitor continues, explaining that out of 133 countries, protesters were detained for exercising their right to peaceful assembly in 90. In places like Russia, Iran, China, Saudi Arabia, and Belarus, any attempts for people to peacefully criticize or resist the injustices of their governments are brutally shut down. In Russia, for instance, dissent has been criminalized. The BBC writes that 15,000 anti-war protesters have been detained since the invasion of Ukraine began. In Iran, protests for women's rights were met with extreme repression. Attorney House states that the government responded with lethal force, with 550 people killed and 19,000 Iranians arrested. We saw a similar tragedy when the Chinese government slaughtered nonviolent protesters. Amnesty International reports that thousands of protesters peacefully calling for reforms were killed by troops around Tiananmen Square. In politically oppressive regimes, holding up signs and marching in the streets is futile because the government guns down protesters with no remorse. There is no free press, no religious institutions, no electoral system, and none of the other pathways that allow the people's wants to influence the government. Contention two is that in these situations of political oppression, where the rights to speech, assembly, and due process are non-existent, violent revolution is justified because it is the only way to protect people's rights. In authoritarian regimes, nonviolence will not work. Oppressive governments respond to both peaceful and violent resistance with brutal repression. Take Central America, for instance. Professor Goodwin from New York University explains that radical organizations mobilized revolutions in Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala because of the brutal violence with which states greeted nonviolent means. As a result of state repression, reformist organizations were unavailable. And it's not just those three examples. Goodwin analyzed 56 revolutions in total and found that virtually every revolution developed under a repressive regime, including the Bolsheviks, the communists in China and Cuba, and the guerrilla movements of Central America. Groups turned to armed struggle only after their previous efforts to secure change through legal means were violently repressed. against political oppression. Violence is the only way to make change because refusing to use violence just makes the government that much stronger. If you don't use violence, they will. That's exactly what happened in Romania and Albania, where people were successful in forcing transitions to democracy with violence. Professor Porta explains that violent uprisings for democracy in Romania and Albania erupted as peaceful protests were unsuccessful in bringing about democratization, instead developing into armed conflicts. And those revolutions worked, ushering in free elections in both nations just 1 year later. More importantly, the Romanians succeeded with minimal civilian casualties. In total, 1,100 people died, but when you compare that to the 60,000 massacred by the regime, the revolution saved far more lives than it cost. Porta continues by giving 2 more examples, explaining that the transition in Peru is evidence that democracies can be constructed amid violence, and the transition in the Philippines is proof that democracy can be constructed with large guerrilla presence and armed mobilization of the poor. But revolutions don't exist in a vacuum. Revolutions that occur in one country influence the governments around them. Professor Kalnitsky from Western University empirically analyzed 171 nations and found that when revolutions transpired, countries nearby are more likely to have become democratic. In particular, the growth in percent democracy was 34% and equality of 12%. And look, at the end of the day, when your back is up against the wall and the Gestapo is knocking at your door to take your family to a concentration camp, you have an absolute right to use violence to protect your life. Dr. Little from Georgetown explains that faced with oppression, humans have the right to exercise legitimate force as a last resort in response to tyrants and oppressors. Let me be the first to say, violent revolutions are turbulent and messy, but don't let perfection be the enemy of the good. History tells us that revolutions are the only way to make meaningful and lasting change. Thank you, and I'm open for 3 minutes of cross-examination. Huh? Yes, of course.
Are all 11 of my judges set for cross-examination? Okay, 3 minutes. First, let's start on what revolution is. Does the first affirmative constructive read a definition of revolution?
It does not define revolution, but it's typically understood as something that aims to overthrow the existing governments, and the notion of violence means it involves violence.
Okay, let's get into the specifics of some of the revolutions that you cite. For Albania and Romania, were those new governments elected, or were they put in place by violence?
They were elected because of violence. Remember, my evidence explains that prior to the revolutions, free elections in Romania and Albania were non-existent. So yes, the new governments were elected peacefully, but only because violence unlocked free elections.
All right, let's move towards the Goodwin evidence that you cite. So you talk a lot about revolution being a condition of repression. Does Goodwin give any other extraneous circumstances that push revolution to be the last resort?
Goodwin explains that when nonviolent means are brutally shut down and there is no legal and peaceful pathway for the oppressed to achieve recourse, then they mobilize revolutions.
To clarify, you're saying that Goodwin claims repression is the reason why the last resort is violence.
The Goodwin evidence explicitly states that every single revolution we have seen in history developed under an extremely repressive regime.
All right, let's move on towards your criterion of human rights. So how do we measure between a rights violation?
Well, the Rawls evidence explains that injustices are only tolerable if they are absolutely necessary to prevent greater injustices. So if I have to kill someone in self-defense, that is tolerable because no one can force me to sacrifice my right to life.
To clarify, that means that the right to use any violence is only permissible when it is absolutely necessary.
Yes, and the affirmative case defends that violent revolutions empirically only emerge in last resort scenarios, and that violence is only justified because political oppression is always a last resort scenario.
Okay, next let's move on towards some of the nitty-gritty. For rights violations, if I am a violent revolutionary and I'm trying to exercise my rights to revolt against a repressive regime as you outline it, when do I have the right to kill an innocent person?
Well, remember, revolutionaries who deliberately target innocent civilians are no longer revolutionaries. They are just terrorists. That's what my second observation clarifies. But the other thing that we have to be conscious of is that the context of political oppression means that innocent people are already dying.
Let's stay on that point for a second. Do you have any evidence of a revolution that never killed a single innocent person?
No, but I don't think that revolutionaries target innocent people deliberately. That's a different matter.
So for them to be terrorists, they have to specifically target innocent people?
Yes, because that is just terrorism.
All right, that's cross-examination. I'm going to be taking prep with a stopwatch. I'll let you know how much I took at the end. That's 1 minute and 30 seconds of prep time, which means I'm going to have 2 minutes and 30 seconds for my second negative rebuttal. The order is just going to be NCAC, so I'll be reading my case, and then I'll be moving over, let me move this around. And then I'll be moving over to the affirmative side of the flow. Is everybody ready? Is my opponent ready? 7 minutes. I negate the resolution resolved. Violent revolution is a just response to political oppression. The value is legitimacy, as the resolution is a question of how to produce more just government and political oppression. Because all are equal and have unique viewpoints, governments must fundamentally value plurality through discourse. That's Tamil and D'Entendres 25. In a public space, citizens meet, exchange opinions, and search for collective solution. Unity can be attained by sharing a public space. Thus, the criterion is constructing non-oppressive public spheres. Tamil and D'Entendres continue. Power, unlike force, is the outcome of collective engagement based on consent through unconstrained discussion. Legitimacy is dependent on the active consent of the people. To clarify the debate, I'll offer the following definitions. First, Oxford defines a revolution as an overthrow of a government in favor of a new system. Thus, the affirmative burden is to prove violence is desirable foundations for new political orders. The affirmative must defend the use of violence to achieve both components of a revolution. Second, violent revolution is a term of art that means revolutionary war. That's Buchanan and Mulchowski 23. Revolutions may be violent or nonviolent. The topic of this entry is violent revolution, where violence is occurring on a large scale, revolutionary war. Thus, the resolution concerns the justice of initiating armed insurgency against oppression. Appeals to individual self-defense are irrelevant. The sole contention is that violent revolution reproduces oppression. A is instrumentalization. Using violence to change political order only creates more violence, contaminating and dooming its results. That's Jackson 20. It is impossible to separate means and ends of political action. Outcomes are prefigured in the means employed. The practice of violence changes the world, but the most probable change is a more violent world. For example, in response to Yugoslavia's occupation of Croatia, Croatian nationalists revolted violently during World War II. Upon independence, the government immediately began aiding the Holocaust. Despite just cause, they internalized the logic of instrumentality and treated human lives as a means to an end. B is disposability. The affirmative downplays the destruction, omitting war's physical and psychological effects. That's Llewellyn 20. Revolutionary violence is destroying bodies to create transformation, domination in its most extreme form. Eliminating rather than transforming. Violence cannot build because violence is purely about destruction. C is technological pacifism. Tech advances mean revolutionary war can never be justified in the modern world. That's KD 14. Tech made conventional war as indiscriminate as nuclear. Perhaps war was justifiable years ago, but war today is too hard to control. At the beginning of the 20th century, most casualties were military. By the end, most were civilian. Methods of modern war have made just war obsolete. On the affirmative side of the flow. First, we're going to talk about their criterion. 3 responses. 1, my framework is a prerequisite. We understand that human rights are worth protecting because of discussion in non-oppressive public spheres. 2, this framework is too vague. We don't know what human rights we're actually protecting. And 3, human rights can't guide action. What happens when rights come in conflict, like, for example, my right to liberty versus your right to life, as is the case in violent revolution? As an overview for both contentions, the affirmative will play on deep-seated biases that violence is a fundamental part of humanity. This round exists in the context of a military-industrial complex where violence is promoted at every turn. While evaluating this debate, you should reject warmongering biases since they cloud judgment. That's KD 23. Warism is the view that war is morally justifiable. Warism distorts our thinking and makes decisions regarding large-scale violence mistaken. Most of us have no idea the presumption of violence has us taking violence as normal, necessary, and morally warranted. On their first contention, First, nonviolence can always succeed through innovation. That's Jackson 20. Revolutionary nonviolence is still in the process of invention. Compared to violence, we have hardly begun to try it. Growing literatures document nonviolent resistance employed around the world and throughout history. This is proven by strikes and stay-at-home actions. Resistance doesn't need to be violent to be disruptive. For example, the Indian independence movement used hartals, which combined a mass strike and boycott to shut down economic life and disrupt colonial administration. 2, even a failed nonviolent campaign is better than a successful violent one. Failed nonviolence sets the stage for future successes, while violence re-entrenches tyranny. That's Chenoweth and Stephen 11. The average country with a failed nonviolent campaign has a 35% chance of democracy. Regardless of whether the violent insurgency succeeds or fails, the level of democracy is lower. The 1AR might read evidence from Chenoweth in 25. Remember that while Chenoweth concedes success rates for violence are better than they anticipated, they do not revoke data about results. That is, that violent revolution fails to create democracy. 3, note there are examples of repressive governments or states founded on violence. Belarus and Russia were established violently through the Russian Revolution, so was China. Both the Iranian and Saudi Arabian governments were established by violent colonization from the West. This proves violence creates oppressors, not freedom. 4, violence fails in these states too. 2 examples. A, in Russia, the violent Wagner revolt 2 years ago was crushed easily when a military group tried to stage a coup. B, in Iran, rebels have been fighting in the Kurdistan region since 1979 with over 30,000 killed with no change in their political situation. Violence is constantly being attempted, yet it doesn't work. Meanwhile, the Iranian Mahsa Amini protests made far more progress. That's the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in 23. Despite crackdown, there has been a rise in Iranian professionals who advocate women's issues. Prominent Iranian women remove hijabs, new grassroots organizations support women in Iran. Iranian women are resolute in their pursuit of rights, a revolutionary act in and of itself that instills a sense of hope. On their contention too. 1, the last option is not always just. The US bombed Hiroshima as a last resort, which was certainly unjust. 2, their own Goodwin evidence says that revolutionaries force the last resort. This is the same Jeff Goodwin in 01. Revolutionaries use violence against civilians and competitors, not just the state. To ensure they are seen as the only viable alternative, some employ violence purposefully to provoke state repression. 3, on Romania, Romania's turn to violence let the army co-opt revolution, which proves our argument about the revolving door. That's Filimi 09. The world watched a mass uprising against the regime. The revolution was a facade. Romania was still run by the old guard. Demonstrations between 1990 and 92 were routinely attacked by coal miners. 4, Albania, Peru, and the Philippines were democratically elected, which excludes our definition. And lastly, on their Kalnitsky and Wanamaker evidence, turn, violent revolutions increase backsliding. That's Kalnitsky and Wanamaker 23. The prevalence of revolution have adverse effects. Revolutionary sentiments create social instability. Thus, I negate, and I'm open for cross-examination.
If everyone is ready for 3 minutes of cross, I'll begin on my first word. Everyone good? Awesome. Can non-oppressive public spheres exist in places where you do not have a right to speech, association, or assembly?
Yes.
How?
Non-oppressive public spheres are about understanding humanity. That means a non-oppressive public sphere is your family, it's your friends, it's your neighborhood.
Is there a non-oppressive public sphere in North Korea?
Yeah.
There is, really?
Families exist in North Korea.
Okay,
the
so
Tamil and D'Entendres evidence is clear.
So the only definition of a public sphere, or the only example they'll give of one in an authoritarian regime is family life.
That's not what I said.
Okay.
I give you one example. Would you like me to give you more?
Yeah, can you explain to me what first, can you give me a definition of what a public sphere is?
Yeah, so Tamil and D'Entendres is clear that a public sphere is a place where peoples meet and have unconstrained discussion. That can happen anywhere.
So in regimes where the government restricts discourse and your rights to speech, assembly, and association, how can you say that discussion is unrestrained?
First of all, like I said, a family, a neighborhood, friends are all unconstrained discussions. There is no evidence
you think that in South Africa there wasn't constraints on family or friendship relationships?
I didn't say that. I gave you a couple examples. Again, there are more.
Okay.
Even the people you work with, that's a non-oppressive public sphere. It's about understanding the fundamental equality of humanity.
I'd like to move on to some of the other arguments that you make, specifically on your first contention. You read evidence from Jackson that states that violence always becomes an end in itself. Is it your argument that violence always and inherently becomes an end in itself?
We say that violence to create a new political order inherently creates a violent government.
Always.
That's correct.
Okay, so every single time that violence is used to create a government, it becomes an end in itself.
Yes.
Okay, sure. I'd like to ask about these specific examples, the specific argument that you bring up about how nonviolence will innovates. Can you explain to me how nonviolence will innovate in Russia after Alexei Navalny, a peaceful pro-democracy candidate, was arrested, disappeared, and then murdered?
So, first of all, that doesn't mean, first of all, that just proves that violent revolution will also fail.
He was nonviolent?
Second of all, if a nonviolent protester was arrested and murdered, what are they going to do to the revolution?
That's fundamentally not responsive to my question.
Yeah,
Can you predict and explain to me how nonviolence will evolve in Russia in the coming years?
Sure. Nonviolence can evolve in a lot of ways. I would anticipate, because they've done a lot of protesting and use of the media, that they might move towards economic boycotts and strikes like the Indian independence movement.
You think that economic boycotts are not currently happening in Russia, that one of the most sanctioned governments in the world?
Okay, sanctions are imposed by international governments. Citizens have a boycott. That's a different thing.
Okay, but your only argument is
that doesn't mean that boycotts can't escalate like they did in the Indian independence movement. That's
your argument is that in Russia, people should simply boycott. That's how nonviolence will look in Russia in the upcoming years.
I gave you one example of how nonviolence can innovate. Second, because nonviolence is constantly innovating, it means we can't always predict it.
The order for this speech will just be the affirmative case beginning with framework and then the negative case. If everybody is ready, then I'll begin this 4-minute first affirmative rebuttal on my first word. Everybody is good? Awesome. Let's begin on the level of framework. Now here, against my value criterion of protecting human rights, my opponent essentially makes a couple of arguments. First, she makes the argument that discourse is a prerequisite because we don't know what rights we are protecting, but that's not true. The Rawls evidence states that each person has a fundamental right to things like life, liberty, health, and security, and those are all rights that are also codified in things like the UN Declaration of Human Rights, so we know what rights have. Second, my opponent makes the argument that rights will inevitably conflict, and that is true, but some rights are more important. Of course, the right to life and liberty are the most fundamental, and the affirmative is best for defending them. But finally, my opponent makes this argument that we should always reject more warmongering biases. But my 1AC is the exact opposite of warmongering. My AF is saying that we can only use violence in places where non-violence will not work. So we are not warmongering. We are trying to be peaceful, but the oppressive government is stopping us. Now, on my first contention, my opponent makes a couple of arguments about why non-violence is effective, but the most important thing to remember here is that she concedes the core thesis claim of this contention, which is that in regimes where you do not have a right to speech, assembly, or due process, your nonviolence can never begin in the first place. If you are arrested for leaving your house or disappeared for simply speaking out, then the only way to escape that infinite cycle is at some points to violently resist arrest. But here, my opponent makes a couple of arguments, most notably that nonviolence will always innovate. First, nonviolence cannot begin to innovate if it can't begin ever at all. That's our first argument. But second, you cannot predict innovation, and it is unjust to tell somebody whose family is literally being disappeared that they have to wait and sit quietly for nonviolence to evolve. Next, my opponent brings up these arguments about the Indian independence movements, but it only succeeded because World War II left Britain and the other colonial powers in Europe militarily and financially crippled. But finally, my opponent brings up these arguments about Chenoweth and these other arguments that we should always turn to nonviolence, even if it fails. But look, where nonviolence is failing, violence is effective. That's all of our examples of places like Nicaragua, Guatemala, and El Salvador on my second contention. Finally, my opponent makes the argument that the Kurds have failed in Iran, but that's not true. The Kurds were successful in forcing the Syrian government out, and they were literally and Saddam Hussein in Iran was using chemical weapons on them. They are the exact definition of somebody who is just and revolting. Now, on my second contention, what I tell you is that revolutions only emerge when there is no other way out. My opponent makes this indict on my Goodwin evidence, but it's faulty. The Goodwin evidence explicitly states that revolutions only emerge in states where the government forced a last resort scenario. Next, she makes the argument that Romania failed, but it didn't. It emerged free elections with minimal civilian casualties. Finally, she argues that Albania, the Philippines, and Peru was democratic and nonviolent, but that's not true. The Porta evidence and the Goodwin evidence tells you that violent uprisings in Romania, Peru, and the Philippines were the reason why free elections happened, and any democratic outcomes were only unlocked because of violence. Let's go on to her case. At the first level of framework, realize that my opponent's value of legitimacy is essentially the same thing as justice, so this debate is a wash. But on her value criterion of non-oppressive public spheres, realize that removing political oppression is a prerequisite to having a non-oppressive public sphere. And her framework collapses into the only question, which is still, how should we best overthrow the violent governments? Because violence is the best way to do that, then you affirm under my opponent's framework as well. Now, on her only contention, realize that the Jackson and Lewell evidence can be grouped and has the two same responses. First, any claim that uses the language of always has a tremendously high burden of proof to bear, and neither the Jackson nor the Lewell evidence gives a single example to back it up. But second, absolute claims can be answered with a single example, but I give you far more than that. Romania, Albania, Peru, the Philippines, Britain, and America all prove that violence can be both constructive and does not necessarily become an end in itself. In America, the violent revolution was necessary to produce the first democracy in the world. Finally, my opponent makes the argument that technological advancements means that revolutions and war are no longer just, but realize that the government is the one abusing technology, not the poor. The government is the oppressive one and not the poor, and the poor always have a just option in fighting back, even when modern technologies are making the governments more effective in cracking down on them. Thank you, and for all those reasons, I urge an affirmative ballot.
I have 2 minutes and 30 seconds of prep time left. I'll take that now. That's my prep, which means I have 6 minutes for my second negative rebuttal. The order is just going to be framework, NC, AC, voters, instructions. That will also be at the bottom.
Framework,
yeah, framework, NC, AC. Okay. 6 minutes. Are all my judges ready? Okay. My opponent ready? Perfect. The affirmative tries to escape oppression, but ends up creating a new oppressor. First, let's start on the criterion and burdens debate. We'll concede to their criterion of protecting human rights. There are two ways you can measure this criterion. One is on the intrinsic justice of an action in protecting human rights. The negative wins that debate because violence will always create an intrinsically violent government. That will be on the neg page. Second is in the aggregate of how many human rights we will protect. Understand that the affirmative is initiating armed insurgency and will be murdering hundreds of innocent civilians. That means that in the aggregate, there are going to be far more human rights violations. Next, let's talk about this burdens debate. The 1AR has conceded that violent revolutions means initiating armed insurgency. This means two things. First, they give you a bunch of examples that are not armed insurgency and instead are situations that had some protests and then had a democratically elected government. This is a ridiculous example, first of all, because it would make the next presidential election a revolution since it will be democratically elected, but we've had a bunch of protests, which we all know to be untrue. But second of all, because they've conceded that violent revolution is a term of art. That means that democratically elected governments are not revolutionary. Second of all, understand that this means the negative does not say you cannot defend yourself against oppressors. Self-defense is completely legitimized. With a gun to your head, you can fight back. You can protest, you can strike. You are allowed to riot, but you are not allowed to start an armed insurgency that will kill millions more. Let's talk about this on the negative side of the flow. You can extend contention one, it's going to reproduce oppression. There are two main arguments that we're going to be going for here. First is this A subpoint about instrumentality. The first affirmative rebuttal gives you some examples, but they do not provide any analysis of what actually happens. We do. When you kill or hurt another human being, you see them as an instrument. That's violent revolution. And that mentality does not go away when you are elected to office. In Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge overthrew their monarchy, and what did they do when they got in office? They committed a horrific genocide. That's because they saw their citizens as instruments, and that is what the affirmative is promoting. There's one main response that they have, and that is that we have to disprove all other violent revolutions. We'll answer that here. First of all, yes, we would say that all violent revolutionary governments create means to an end. We'll answer their examples. First of all, they list Philippines, Peru, etc., which were democratically elected governments. They've conceded that is not revolutionary. Their second main example is about America. First of all, America did have a basis of violence. Look towards putting chattel slavery in the Constitution. Look towards the continued genocide of Native Americans as we colonized the rest of the continent, which Britain would not let us do. This proves that violent revolution always creates an oppressor, not a savior. Don't let the second affirmative rebuttal introduce new examples to prove this incorrect, because they're going to contextualize it in a way that makes it seem rosy-daisy and omit the actual details of the people that were hurt by that violent revolution. That means they have not provided an example that actually demonstrates that violent revolution does not always create violent ends, which proves that violent revolution is not going to protect human rights because it intrinsically creates a violent government. Next, extend subpoint C, technological pacifism. This is a key argument in the debate because it means two things. First, this frames out all of these old examples. They might cite France, Haiti, the United States, but because those were 300 years ago, we cannot look towards what that means for a violent revolution today. That means all of their examples should be in the modern day context. Second of all, they've conceded the fact that modern-day armed insurgency, which again is violent revolution, will murder hundreds of civilians. At the start of the 20th century, the main military casualties were military officials. Now it is civilians. With the rise of IEDs, landmines, pipe bombs, drone strikes, this is the technology that will be used in initiating armed insurgency, and they've conceded that it is inherently going to target civilians and murder hundreds more. In the aggregate, that means the negative is the one protecting more human rights, because all of the authoritarian conditions of the original oppressive government will be replicated in the new one, but the difference is that the new one will now be initiating a war that will kill millions more. On the affirmative side of the flow, we're going to group all of their last resort argumentation here. There are two main arguments that we'll address. First is that nonviolence will fail in repressive regimes. They failed to answer the inherent warrant in Jackson 20 that tells you that nonviolence is always innovating. Violence is incredibly used. We've been using it for the past millennia, but nonviolence has only had about 100, probably less than that, years to develop. That means there's always going to be new techniques that are innovating. There are two answers. First is that they can't begin at all. That's categorically untrue. That's an argument without a warrant. Nonviolence can always start because simple things like non-cooperation is nonviolent resistance. Second, they say you can't predict innovation. That's true. That means you can't predict the fact that innovation will not happen, which means they have no argument that will always tell you nonviolence will fail. This means it is never a last resort. Second, they've conceded the fact that last resorts are not always just. The US bombing Hiroshima was not just, and therefore, because violent revolution always creates a violent, revolutionary, and abusive government, it will not be just. Lastly, the next speech will play on your emotions. Recognize that this is going to try and make you feel emotion, but not give you an actual argument. Thus, I negate.
The order of this final affirmative speech will just be a brief overview, the level of framework, the affirmative case, and then the negative case. If everyone is ready, then 3 minutes will begin on my first word. All good? Awesome. The only remaining question that influences your ballot in today's debate is whether violence is an effective way to end political oppression. There are 3 key reasons why it is. The first voting issue in today's debate is on my first contention, where I tell you that nonviolence is ineffective in politically oppressive contexts. Now here, my opponent makes the argument that I have no warrant for why this is true, but that she cannot make that argument in good faith when she concedes the core warrant that I've extended since my first affirmative speech. In places where you do not have a right to speech, assembly, or due process, your nonviolence can never begin in the first place. My opponent concedes the fact that going up against a regime where you are arrested for leaving your house or gunned down in the streets by police who have no care for your life, the only way to escape that infinite cycle is at some points to violently resist arrest. Now here, my opponent only responds to my arguments about last resort scenarios, but she concedes the fact that even politically oppressive regimes like Iran and Syria, the Kurdish rebels were successful in ousting the Syrian government, going up against the chemical weapons of Saddam Hussein, and the Syrian government. This independently answers all of her arguments about new technological powers making violent revolution unjust, because the Syrian revolution happened recently and was successful against chemical weaponry. And that's your first voter issue, that this debate is no longer a question of whether nonviolence versus violence. It's a question of taking whatever remaining shots that we have. And that's your second voter issue, that violence, even if it does not have a guaranteed shot of working, is the only possible way of protecting people's rights in a politically oppressive regime. Now here, my opponent makes two core arguments on my second contention. First, she makes the argument that nonviolence is always innovating, and second, that nonviolence can still start. But remember, she concedes the fact that it is always unjust to tell somebody whose family is actively being disappeared, who is actively being genocide, mass arrested, or enslaved, that they have to simply wait around quietly for nonviolence to innovate. The innovation and evolution of nonviolence is always unpredictable, and people should not be forced to sit quietly while they are actively being genocided by their governments. And remember, she concedes every single example here that I give you. Peru, the Philippines, Romania, Albania only had the democratic and peaceful elections that my opponent is talking about because violence unlocked those scenarios in the first place. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the British Revolution tell you that violence is at the core of every single strong democracy that you can think of. And that's your second voter issue, that violence, even if it does not have a guaranteed shot of working, is the only possible way of battling political oppression. Remember, she concedes Nicaragua, Guatemala, and El Salvador, which all tell you that in places where nonviolence is brutally repressed, violence works. That's your second voter issue. But your third and final voter issue is that my opponent's world makes all of her offensive arguments worse. Remember, this resolution is comparative. You have to consider all of her arguments that come from Lewell and Jackson about violence creating a logic of disposability and violence causing instrumentalization against the active violence of the status quo and her world. The government is always has a greater instrumentalization power. It always has a greater logic of disposability because it has the backing of the state behind it. Genocide, mass enslavement, and political killings are always worse, and they remain in the negative world, but we have a shot of escape in the affirmative world. For those reasons, you affirm.
Good debate.